Okay, well, I know I'm a little behind, but I just finished the hell conversation between Paul and Nate and Paul, Nate, and the guy from Morning Talk. I don't actually remember his name. So, that was a great conversation. Really interesting, really honest. Felt like you guys. Well, I don't know. It certainly felt like he was going through a process. I don't know how much Paul and Nate really changed their views or came to any new realizations in that conversation, to be fair. Which is fine. I mean, you guys are in more kind of stable places religiously than he is, I think, at the moment. You have answers that kind of sort of work for you. There's nothing wrong with that. Couple things, though. I had a couple of thoughts. And this video might, I don't know what I'm going to do with it. I'm just going to post it on, probably post it on my channel, but really mostly directed toward Nate and Paul, I guess. But, why not? So, no, I can't have these windows open, I realize, because otherwise you're not going to hear me well. Cool. Okay. Hopefully that's better. Hopefully the sound's okay. So first thing is I want to clarify a couple points on things that Nate said about Jews or Judaism and stuff. Isn't that why I'm here? So Jewish universalism. So I don't know that I'm going to say anything about most Jews. Most Jews these days don't know anything about Judaism. But there's a rather complex. It's not universal. It's not universalism exactly. And despite what Bulgakov really believes in his essay on, he says Jews, are the only people who are traditionally universalists in the Western religions. So yeah, a little complicated. If you look at most Jewish sources, let's do it that way. Let's not ask most Jews. We look at a lot of Jewish sources. There is kind of like some consensus around part of this, at least. Though anything Jewish, as all of you will know, is always something up for debate. But I think the position you'll see in a lot of sources is so one, you don't have to be Jewish to so we call it the world to come as opposed to heaven or being saved or whatever. We don't even use the concept of salvation really around this issue. It's a very Christian affectation. But there's a difference between the world to come and resurrection in the days of the Messiah. And world to come is in the New Testament called age to come. That's world and age are the same, both translations of the same word, which makes this a little bit funny because I guess we think of world to come, even though it's temporal, we think of it as like another dimension or space, like a dimension of space. Whereas I think by calling it age to come, Christians have it much more as a time to come, and therefore I think that the age to come is more often put with Messiah and like the second coming, whereas for us, we just called the afterlife the world to come, but usually specifically like the good part of the afterlife. So that isn't kind of an interesting difference, but that's really just it's a semantic one, but it also affects our frames in slightly different ways. Okay, so non-Jews and Jews both go to the age to come. The primary purpose of Gehenna is essentially like a purgation process. Like everyone goes through a purgation process, and that process as far as I know, I don't know any source that says that anyone who doesn't have it go through it at all. There are sources that where it's longer or shorter for others, but weirdly enough, not eternal, right? Generally, like, everyone except for the completely wicked, it's only a 12-month process. At max, some people it could be shorter. We generally, so this gets tied into our cycle of mourning practices that go out to the first year. So that's a little different. And then there's kind of a lot more room for debate beyond that point. There is a generally accepted concept that all Jews have a place in the world to come, and it's kind of conceived of in the same way as like the land of Israel was. So everyone has like an inheritance or a portion that's kind of like their ancestral inheritance in the world to come. And basically, I mean, there's a famous Mishnah that says, like, you know, these are the people who don't get a place in the world to come. And they specifically mean Jews in this case. So being Jewish doesn't guarantee you a place, but there's like a place saved for you, almost. And the way you lose that is, so consider like, I don't know, let's say the worst sin, which is causing others to sin. So causing others to publicly sin, I guess. So the list in the Mishnah there is people like Jeroboam, and like who split the kingdom of Israel, but more than that, the sin was he set up, you know, the calves, and created his own priesthood and all that stuff. So there's like 3 or 4 names listed there, like these people, usually kings or people who, you know, are very powerful and cause the masses to sin by leading them to idolatry. I mean, that's the big one. But in that mission, there's also a couple others. I don't have them in front of me, I'm driving. But the others are basically people who deny the world to come exists, or deny God's role in reward and punishment, which is interesting. So basically, if you don't believe in it, you don't get it, which is kind of closer to the Great Divorce almost. I've only listened to half of it. I have a really hard time getting through Lewis books. No offense, Paul, but like I really just dislike his tone. His ideas are interesting, you can explore them, but like especially his kind of more fiction-y stuff, like fantasy stuff, I just really don't like him. But yeah, so I got through half of The Great Divorce. Yeah, I definitely kind of see that there, like, or, you know, potential similarities there. If you deny it, then, you know, you're out of the system. You know, you don't need it doesn't need you, kind of thing. I mean, obviously this is a much bigger thing than that, right? Because it gets into, you know, is that forever? Is that, you know, is that dynamic? Is that, you know, the things happen in time? And I'll talk about that separately in a little bit. But this also gets into this really big political debate, right, in the Second Temple period between the Sadducees and basically all the other Jews, because the Sadducees denied that there was a world to come. They denied the eternality of the soul. So like all stuff like that, right? And this became like a major sectarian point. So basically, one way to read the Mishnah is like, this is just like, you know, you can go to the world to come if you're not a Sadducee, but it's not quite that simple. Because of course the Mishnah is written after the Sadducees are gone, or at least it's compiled. It's finally edited after the Sadducees are gone. So there is a question on, like, are they addressing this old debate? Is there something else here? And there's some interesting kind of development along that point, but I'm not going to get into it. I mean, there's always more to unpack with Jewish stuff, as with all these religious stuff. I'm sure, you know, we can always look up more esoteric stuff, symbolic stuff, exegesis stuff, but I don't want to get too off track. So yeah, there's 2 areas that I basically haven't addressed yet. So one is something I just touched on, which is do people change in the world to come? So we actually kind of see 2 different things on this. And one is, I would say, more fundamentally understood than the other. So there is this concept that you can only, like, the commandments can only be done in this world. And the commandments are, the things that God commands you to do, and are kind of how you show your investment in the relationship with the divine. And you can't do commandments in the world to come. There is a concept that that's tied to this, which is we only have free will in this. Free will is very, very important for us. We only have, and you're freest, and this goes against like a lot of modern sensibility, but you're freest when you're in service to God. That is what sets you free, is being freed from power, let's say, or whatever, the forces of evil, of darkness, of your own. Okay, picking up. Sorry about that. My phone overheated and died. Hopefully this will last for a little bit. So I was discussing, forgive me if I lost the train of thought slightly. Yes, the ultimate freedom is at the choice of whether we listen to God or not, and fear of heaven, and that you see this very much, for instance, right? Even though we don't have absolute free choice, we have lots and lots of constraints in our choice. We have like kind of almost the ultimate freedom in deciding our attitude toward God, and our attitude in general. I mean, this is very Viktor Frankl, like you can always choose your attitude no matter how bad it is, or hope, to have hope in logotherapy. And that's a very, very Jewish idea. And right, this concept of free will is very, very central to Judaism. And it's very important to also note that the angels don't have free will for us. Okay. Humans have free will, God has free will, angels don't have free will. And yes, I know. We have a whole back and forth about this, because we don't come at this at all from the same place. That aside, there is this question about whether humans have free will in the afterlife, which we answer in a sense, no. But it's in a sense. It's not that we don't have the capacity to choose. And this stands in contrast to this other concept about that we have, that in the Talmud, it's a statement that's not challenged, it's kind of just accepted at face value. I don't know anyone who debates it or rejects it. That after death, there is this process of kind of what has been called, right, going further up and further in. Just like, or at least for the righteous, qualified. Right? But there is this kind of, the righteous have this reconciliation process with God. And this is so there's a question like, okay, is after death, is it static or dynamic? And it's dynamic, and there is this further up and further in. On the other hand, it's also somewhat static in that, right, you're no longer choosing. That's not true. You are choosing. The difference is, and you'll hear Jacob talks about this in a couple of places in his videos and server. What you're choosing is you can't do mitzvot anymore. You can still make choices, about how you feel toward God to some extent. However, in the afterlife, the thing that's going to be coming further up and further in is your understanding of reality. And the more you understand of reality, you see the consequences and understand how everything fits together, and the kind of the less choice you have, because you know what's going to happen, and there's no choice without uncertainty in a sense. If you know exactly that this is the better outcome versus that, then you're going to always choose this with 100% certainty, right? So there is this further and further of understanding, such that you kind of you will always choose the good, basically, in the afterlife. So you kind of lose this capacity, in a sense, of choosing anything but the good. Now that we can have a whole discussion about God in that case, does God have choice, but he only chooses the good in the same sense? Is his choice a little more arbitrary? Does God define the good in the first place? There's no good beyond God. All great questions for a different discussion. Okay, so that gets us to a point where there is this reconciliation, at least of everyone who makes it through the purgation process, um, and therefore they become um, basically one with God, or one with God's will, or one with the lower emanation of God. You don't really ever become God. We don't have that. Like that's like trying, right? That's the jump of a level. It's very, very big. There is kind of some Kabbalistic stuff that gets complex here on whether to the souls, from Kabbalah, it's important. There's a big difference, right? Is that they have this concept of reincarnation, but it is not reincarnation like Eastern reincarnation, where it's like an individual soul that keeps coming like down in cycles until it's freed. It's actually much less individualistic, which is kind of a funny thing to say about Eastern religion, but whatever. The Kabbalistic concept is, in fact, souls can split and merge. So each soul kind of has a purpose, as Nate was saying, and it has to like do some fix in the world. And if it succeeds in doing that fix, it kind of merges with like some other souls. I have to go back a minute. All human souls come from a single soul, the soul of the original Adam. Now, you can get into this, there's this difference between the primordial Adam versus like the first like, human Adam, and I'm not a Kabbalist, and this is very, very complicated stuff that it kind of gets tied into something like a parallel to the theology of the fall, but it's a little bit different. It's a lot different, but it's not unrelated. However, we all get restored into the soul of Adam, which is very, very close to the parallel of the Christians understand the body of Christ, in some ways, the spiritual body of Christ, or the spiritual body of the church, maybe. Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of stuff going on there, but for us, so we have a different version of that, and it's likely. I mean, this is one of those things where it's like, wow, we don't have. The earliest thing we have that seems to cite this, as a Jewish thing is the Gospels. They seem to be drawing on something older, and it appears elsewhere in Jewish tradition, but the first written records we have of it are much later. There's this whole debate over, when this tradition became restricted to being oral only within Judaism, and of course there'll be other people who, especially academics, who will say that no, the influence is the other way. Christianity somehow came up with these things on their own, whether it's from Greek sources or totally innovated them, or I guess got them through revelation or prophecy, I don't know. And they got picked up by later Jewish sources. I think that argument in academia, which is now 40, 50 years old, has kind of been, it's just like a lot of, there have been a big push to say all this stuff was not, all Kabbalah was Gnostic originally, which is kind of ironic because, of course, the Gnostics often had strong Jewish Christian influence too, but so how you define these lines is complicated, and where the ideas come from. The traditional Jewish answer is, look, the Christians have the same idea because they got it from us. Whether you can accept that or not. So there's this idea, but what that means is that we all get reincorporated. We don't dissolve into it in a mystica, but there is but there is kind of this the atomization disappears. We all become integrated into a single body. And part of the restoring of the soul of Adam, the reason that it got separated in the first place, was because of the sin of the garden, there was this problem, kind of almost like it was too homogenous. There was this homogeneity that was an issue. You also see this in the Tower of Babel, this issue of homogeneity, and that the multiplicity is necessary, not at the divine, at the level of God himself. That's obviously a difference we have with Christians. But the multiplicity is necessary within creation, and especially within humanity. Hence why Adam isn't good to be alone. It has to be two Adams. There should be two people, or a society. Society is the same world, and all of those concepts come in there. Okay, so I've rambled a long time. hopefully that was somewhat useful. I guess, so what I didn't really address is, so what happens, let's say the really wicked who don't go into the world to come. And there's another question, which is, okay, what about non-Jews? So this gets a little complicated, because there's not really a lot of agreement on this part. The Rambam actually is something very, very similar to the Eastern Orthodox, in that he does kind of see something of this, like, creating your own hell on earth, living through hell, as his understanding of a lot of the rabbinic statements about hell, but it appears that he basically is, for people who don't have purgation and don't make it through, he doesn't really believe in eternal conscious torment or anything like that. He believes in annihilationism. And that is a pretty valid, he's not the only one. This isn't just like Rambam coming out of nowhere. The annihilationist position is certainly there, and that reading of the rabbinic material certainly exists. There is this other challenge, though, that you come across with the idea of resurrection, because here we do have these verses in Daniel about both the wicked and the good being resurrected. And as I said, resurrection and afterlife are a little different. We don't conflate them. So that's an important difference. Gosh. Okay, I might have to put on my GPS and come back to this video. But to put it shortly, there are differences. They're sort of important. So I was saying annihilationism. There are a couple images of, like, that the Talmud does use of people, like, suffering in hell. There are questions if those, there's certainly that whole idea that it would be eternal in the way that the modern concept is different. But there's no consensus around this part, honestly, what happens to those souls that don't. Generally, though, so for the vast majority of Jews do not have this issue. Now, there's the question of non-Jews. Generally, for non-Jews have much, much, much fewer commandments. There's kind of two competing concepts of what non-Jews have to do, let's say, to get into heaven, to use kind of a very reductionist and sort of Christian framing. There's the 7 Noahide mitzvahs, and saying, okay, you just have to fulfill those and you get into heaven. And that's like, most people fulfill most of those most of the time. That's kind of an easy one. And if they don't, okay, so they go through the same purgation process. What does that mean? What does that look like? If you don't, is it annihilation? Is it ultimate reconciliation? Is it reconciliation, but like for most people, but not everyone, like it is for Jews? So there's like debates all over the map in that section. And there's a second set, which is instead of the Noahide laws. Well, sorry about that. Getting too hot up on my windshield there. I know this is not the best angle to talk at, but I wanted to finish this video. It's so close. We're getting there. So I got cut off just at the part with, so the second model is, instead of being for the laws of Noah, kind of being the standard to keep, there's a second model, which is it's like righteous among the nations, which actually they're probably complementary models, honestly. It's not like one or the other, but there are things that someone can do that are just really good things, and it might be a once in a lifetime thing. It may not be their whole life. It may not be, or that they got to this point when they died. So this is most classically seen in the post-Holocaust world, where we have like an actual monument to the righteous among the nations for people who saved lives during the Holocaust. But this is also, it's not necessarily limited to just helping Jews. People who've done things to save other people's lives, to preserve the world, to rescue people. In general, I mean, that type of stuff there seems to be like a whole set of like, you know, I don't know how you'd say it, but like that also seems to be very important and valued, and whether that's like has a strong theological basis, which it might. There's some evidence potentially in the late prophets, especially kind of in the I would call the theology of the King of David, where you see stuff like that. But it's mostly developed in the medieval and modern period. That this concept of this other thing. Now, of course, that's also true for the commandments of the son of Noah, even though that goes all the way back for a very long time. Something like it exists in the Book of Jubilees. It probably is being discussed in the New Testament. Certainly, by the time that the temple was destroyed and the early rabbinic materials, we see lots of stuff around that. Wow, bad accident. But a lot of the stuff there around like questions about, let's say, what happens to non-Jews when they die, really, no one is really talking about, because like, what are we, like, it's not, it almost like doesn't matter, because like we're not making rules or regulating non-Jewish life, and non-Jews should live the way they live, to some extent. Like, it's already kind of amorphous what it means for us, to encourage or teach or do anything with the laws of Noah. Honestly, until the last Chabad Rebbe picked up on something that's in Maimonides and no one else before Maimonides, at least of the rabbinic period, who talks, I think for them, it's the New Testament. I mean, about there's an actual commandment to encourage non-Jews to keep the laws of Noah and spread that. Every other rabbinic authority rejects that position, and which is fascinating. And Maimonides was kind of a lone voice on this, and why is an interesting point. And it's interesting because this is one of those areas where Chabad today, and to some extent maybe modern Orthodox, because modern Orthodox, Jacob will be happy to tell you, are very, very Maimonidean. But Chabad, by far more so on this point, believe that they have a mandate to spread, what the laws of Noah are to non-Jews and to encourage their keeping. Whereas, like other parts of the Jewish world, probably people in this little corner will not realize that this is actually really, really rare and controversial, because the majority position among the rabbinic sources in both the early and late periods were just, they're kind of out of our jurisdiction. Like, we have this idea, we have these ideals. There's some sort of kind of natural law ideals for the most part, which is something else that Maimonides rejects, importantly, to this discussion. But they're natural law ideals, and they'll come to them, like people, societies will kind of automatically come to them. And I think that's actually kind of a little complicated, because, well, most of them are natural law ideals. The stuff around eating blood either and or / the limb of a living animal, and those are not necessarily natural ideas. And then there's another big question, which is idol worship natural law or not? And for the most part, the rabbis kind of agree that it is. There's various explanations of how and why. I don't think the modern framing of natural law necessarily would agree. This depends on what your frame is. Anyway, so that's a whole big part of this discussion as well. For Maimonides, it's not natural law. For Maimonides, it doesn't count unless you know that you're doing it because God commanded you, just like for the Jews. It's a covenant. It's a covenant that is a covenant. It has to be done with awareness and consent and like all those things. And like you have to do it not because you believe that God commanded you to do it, and that puts the whole relationship in a very different frame than a natural law relationship. Okay, well that's enough about my jaunt into Noahide stuff for a second. But I do think it's important because it all has bearing on this. because most Jews that you meet are basically going to be pretty close to universalists, including a number of Orthodox Jews, or they'll be what I call much closer near universalists. So they don't necessarily have a reconciliation of all things in the same way, but like as a Christian might, for the universalist Christians. But they certainly have this idea, especially from the Kabbalistic world, where everything gets redeemed and reintegrated into the one, into God, into God's creation, as it was originally kind of meant to be, except like in a new configuration where it's stable, let's say, where everything's in balance and in harmony, where mercy and justice are in harmony, where I don't know. I mean, there's all the Sefirot in harmony, right? And the Sefirot, both like in the divine sense, like in the supernal realms, but also the macrocosm version, the microcosm version, the cosmological version, right? And like Earth, humanity, the heavens are all in one accord. That is kind of the reconciliation of all things that you get in Kabbalah. And I don't really think there's an annihilationism there. For them, and this is different than the Rambam. For them, the soul that doesn't get redeemed doesn't like disappear. It gets split, and each time it gets split again, like that, then those new individual souls need to then redeem themselves, or manage to fulfill their missions properly on Earth, such that they can join back to a new combined soul that's like a healthier, fuller soul that's going to then be reincarnated into yet another human being. And this process continues as souls kind of rectify themselves, going on and up and up and up until all souls are reconnected together in a single, the single soul of Adam. So, I didn't finish that idea before. Okay, so now you have the combination. Sorry about that. Now you have the combination of all souls, and they get split because of not fulfilling their purpose, mission, goals, or in sinning, etc. And then they recombine that way. That finishes the picture of that. So you have that version of kind of reconciliation of all things. You also have a version of reconciliation of all things that I would say is much more general, and like the universalism in the liberal movements of Judaism, which will just tell you. I mean, if you ask most liberal Jews, they'll say something like Jews don't believe in hell, and they're getting that from the idea that we don't really believe in eternal conscious torment as much as purgatory. And honestly, they probably have never even seen the passages in the Talmud that discuss kind of, let's say, longer periods or types of torture or whatever like that. They're allegorical. We're not imagining like a real place of fire and brimstone. Or at least most Jews, even Orthodox ones, are not really picturing this place of fire and brimstone. Okay, cool. So that gets you. But there are within Orthodoxy that's less Kabbalistic, more influenced by Maimonides. There will be some annihilationists to some degree, and it's basically this balance between kind of this pseudo-universalism and annihilationism. And like kind of then it's just a question of like where the person draws the line, as far as like, do they think that most people kind of are mostly good most of the time type category? Is it, do they just draw that line for Jews, but are they more annihilationist for non-Jews? Where some non-Jews get into heaven, but others like just disappear. And they'll believe that, of course, they won't believe that it's universal of all Jews, right? They'll believe it about most, right? 99%, 99 point whatever percent. So, and then it's just a question of where people draw the line. And honestly, I say all this stuff. I don't know, what have I gone for? 35 minutes, 45 minutes now recording between these couple segments? I just want to say that the main point of the things that they were talking about in that hell video is the same point for us. They trust in God, and we're not really supposed to think about these things. And there's bigger warnings, I think, for us than for Christians. This was in the very first conversation with Paul, right? The very first thing we talked about was we have this concept in Masechet Chagiga in the Talmud, based on something from Ben Sira that says, don't, there's like limits to human investigation. You're not going to be able to get everywhere. Don't look too high up, or too far down, or too far ahead, or too far behind. And it's not just like, that's both the reality that we're limited finite beings that with limited knowledge, and acknowledging that, but it's also like, don't spend too much time thinking about this. However, at the same time, you have things like Pirkei Avot, which the Ethics of the Fathers, which hopefully Chezi will be teaching a class in soon on maybe through Jacob's channel or maybe his own. That's maybe we're on Those United, I don't even know. Where we get no, probably not. Things like, you should keep in mind, you're not really supposed to think about these things and work them out theologically and like all that stuff, and like don't get too caught up in these debates. That's not where we're going with this stuff. Like, yes, there's lots of opinions and people have a lot of different thoughts and derive different things from different Bible verses and semantic theology, whatever. But like, this is not worth spending massive amounts of time on, which is why you're probably not going to find a lot of explanations online about a lot of this stuff beyond kind of a general, like, Jews don't believe in hell thing. And part of it's just like, yeah, this isn't a good use of our time. Just like speculating about when the Messiah will come is not a great use of our time. We hope every day that the Messiah will come. We have faith and trust that God will take, we'll sort out the afterlife as necessary. We hope that we're going to, be among those who have better understanding at that point of his plans and of the world and how everything fits together. We hope we're righteous enough at least to merit that. We get to have a taste of the world to come every Sabbath in this world, which is lovely. And we have what to anticipate. And we should, and I was saying, through the Ethics of the Fathers, like we are supposed to keep in mind that, like, yes, there is kind of, this world is not the whole show. There is something bigger than this going on, bigger than us going on, and we aren't really supposed to. We're not supposed to forget that. We're supposed to. I mean, there's a famous thing saying, "Know from whence you came, from where you're going, and who you will go before when you are judged." So that's kind of at the level where, like, one should really be contemplating these things and not necessarily too much deeper. But I feel like there's enough interest in this. There's enough people who are like have questions, and I think the Jewish stuff should be at least clarified for those people who are interested in it. But I don't want to give the wrong impression. I am more of a universalist than some Jews, but I'm less in other ways. Right? I call myself like a pseudo-universalist. Okay. That was one big area. I do want to clarify. Keeps falling. I'm so sorry about that. And not that, like, seeing the side of my face or seeing the top of my car, probably both aren't great. Okay, cool. So the other thing I want to clarify is the idea of being put on this world which, as Nate put it, for like, it could be just this, have a single conversation. This is a lot more complicated than that. We don't think anything goes to waste, right? Your whole life is your whole life, and it's necessary. Your whole life is necessary for God's plan. Otherwise, it wouldn't happen. Now, that's a big statement to say. And that's true for every single person. Every single person is created because they're necessary for this world to exist and for God's, ultimate telos, for reality to come about. And to bring Messiah, even. The good and the bad, and every good and bad act everyone else is do, and all the formative processes and all the things we think, and all of that is all part of this process. That is a pretty foundational Jewish idea. Now, how much of that is, predetermined by God, free will, compatibilism, like all those questions, I'm not going to deal with right now. I've touched on them a couple places in this talk. We're not dealing with those right now. Just the general idea that everything has a purpose in this world, every moment has a purpose, every act. Now, this gets complicated, as you guys pointed out in your hell discussion. Because there are people who express this as, how do I know that I wasn't meant to do, that wasn't my, the main reason I was put here wasn't for X. That's a statement. There's a famous story by the Chabad Rebbe about that.
Where how do you know? Someone prevented him from talking to someone else, and he said, "How do you know that I wasn't supposed to have that conversation?" That could be the reason why my soul came down to earth. There are people who put it like that, but it's not. The Chabad Rebbe, of all people, did not believe that was the only reason his soul was put on earth. And he certainly saw his entire life as every moment of his life as having that mission. So you're not supposed to, as someone said in that conversation, it was like, oh, my fear of if that's your goal is you'll think everything else doesn't matter. Like that's, you'll have judged that's the moment why you were put in the world, and therefore like nothing else matters. No, that's not where we're going with this, and that's not how we understand that concept. You were put here, and this gets into a little bit of a complicated thing that Rav Soloveitchik talks about in one of his books, a couple of his books actually, which is we all basically have the same. So each group of people has basically the same commandments. So all non-Jews, all Jews, even within that, not necessarily all Jews have every commandment. You have priests have their commandments, women have their commandments, men, soldiers, kings, but like, as a class of people, unless you're like the high priest or the king, and even them, like as the group of Jewish kings or the group of high priests that ever existed, they're a class of people, have commandments that everyone's expected to be able to keep. God doesn't give us commandments that we can't keep, because like that wouldn't make any sense. They're not, as it says in Deuteronomy, these are not in the heavens. Deuteronomy's Exodus. Shoot. Okay, whatever. So not in the heavens. Everything, the Torah is, at least the majority understanding of it, leaving Nachmanides aside. The Torah is something that's doable, graspable, and everyone can reach it. You get it. And by Torah, I mean like what God asks of us, of all of us. However, that we each have different qualities and strengths, and we also have an obligation, in a general sense, to develop those strengths. As another thing we believe. Whether they're intellectual, creative, whether personable or social, right? Like if you're the person who is really good at talking to people, or is really drawn to being the person who sits at the door, as Chad would put it, or Lance, right? The greeter at AA. Like if that's the thing that calls you, don't ignore that, right? Like that's that might be your calling in the world, and you should develop things that call you like that, or are your strengths, and like that's something you should not ignore. That is above and beyond the commandments. The commandments are the baseline. They're not the fulfilling the law is not fulfilling the letter of the law. Fulfilling the law is fulfilling the love of the law and also the spirit of the law, right? It's just the baseline. It's a start. The law is there to shape and guide us. And shape our behaviors, to inculcate within us, proper attitudes, intentions, beliefs, attention, relationships. Like, that's fundamental. Anyway, So I just wanted to clarify that bit, and I wanted to also just put one comment. This isn't specifically Jewish, but I think it gets to what I just said from the ethics of the fathers and remembering, that we're part of a bigger thing. I mean, that was, I thought, a really, really good part of Paul Vanderklay's message in that video, which was his point about that things have kind of gotten very flattened in this kind of a flat world. Everything's like imminent, so like hell has to be in this world, judgment has to be in this world, heaven has to be in this world. Like that is a very flat world view that is, I think, very much part of what that saying, the ethics of the fathers, is trying to push against, and recognizing that this world is part of a much larger picture. Anyway, I'm sorry about all the camera problems. I'm sorry about the overheating, but I just saw the video. I wanted to get this all down. If only 3 people watch this, I don't really care. But I hope that you'll forgive me for all that stuff. I hope this was useful. To kind of give a taste of some of how we think about these things, because they are different, and I didn't even touch into how they might interweave with Messiah or resurrection on purpose, because we see those as separate things. Now, depending if you're Maimonides or Nachmanides or Rav Tzadok of Lublin, like you'll have different visions of how they interact and intertwine, and like there's lots of ways to think about this stuff. One of the nice things is Jews are not theologically split generally over this issue, and haven't since the Sadducees and Pharisees split, right? So in about 2,000 years, we haven't really split over these types of theological issues because they are secondary in some ways. And now this gets into a whole other can of worms. I'm not going to touch too much, but it is one of the 13 principles that there is a system to believe. So 13 principles. How do I explain this? We don't have dogmas. We don't have creeds. Jacob will tell you he wants us to have dogmas and creeds. I'm very against the idea, fundamentally, for a lot of reasons. However, there are some things called fundamental principles. In the Middle Ages, under the influence of Islam and Christianity, Jews are kind of pressed to try to formulate what their big position, let's say, dogmas might be. But they didn't think of them as dogmas, but instead because the people doing this were rationalists like Maimonides and Chassidei Crescas, and mostly people of the Spanish kind of, I'd say they're post-Golden Age of Spain, but they tend to be 13th, 14th century Spaniards for the most part, who are working. Whoa, sorry about that. Wow, now you really got a bad camera angle. 13th, 14th century, mostly Spaniards, or certainly Sephardim, who had Spanish origins and of the Spanish milieu, who are pretty much learning Greek philosophy, science, and math. And the way they approach the question of, okay, how do we formulate these things is sort of like, what are the axioms? What are the fundamental axioms of Judaism? That if you believe in these axioms, the entire system, all of the laws, all the derivation, the philosophy, theology, even all the debates, what framework do you need axiomatically to sort of accept for all of this to work? Now there are a couple lists of these. There's two particularly famous ones, one that's not quite as famous as the other. The slightly less famous one is there's one that's a 3-axiom system, and the much more famous one than that is a 13-axiom system. That is of Maimonides. Now, we call these the 13 principles of faith, usually, though actually, if you look at Maimonides' manuscript, that's not what he calls them initially. Then he goes back and forth on his language, but he actually calls them the 13 principles of knowledge, weirdly enough. Maybe. He is thinking of knowledge in a much more Vervaekian, multiple P sense, but there's a reason he calls these are principles of knowledge and not faith, because they're axioms to one's ontology and epistemology and everything. Mostly epistemology. And he's kind of aware of that. That being said, one of the 13 principles, just one, is devoted to this, believing in that there is a system of justice, basically. It's sometimes called a system of reward and punishment, but basically, divine justice exists, is a fundamental axiom for him. And that includes, belief in the world to come. It's separate from the axiom about belief in Messiah. Okay, so that's an important, right? So you see there's separation in his thought there. And it's separate from there being God, and it's separate from, God revealing his will to the world. That there is a system, or not a system's probably a bad word for this, but God is just. And kind of trusting that is important. And it's not we don't have to sort it out, and we should not be looking through our lives trying to judge, okay, was this the moment, was that the moment? We do judge ourselves. We certainly need to go over our actions, and minimally meet the baseline of the law, if not the spirit of the law, right? But both are really important here, and that is important. And we have a bunch of principles that are very similar to some of the New Testament quotes that you guys were pulling out during the Hell conversation. Most famously, there's a lot of them, and I'm not going to do them justice. But there's one that comes to mind off the top of my head I'm going to probably end on, which is God judges us the way that we judge others, which I really like. And yeah, I think with that I'm going to end, and hopefully I can splice these together into something sensible. And I didn't ramble too long, but I hope someone gets something out of this. Otherwise, okay, I talked to myself for an hour, not the end of the world.